Earlier this week, we marked October 7, the first anniversary of the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust, and segments of the media used the date to attack Israel and its ongoing war with Hamas. The Independent in the UK had this front page: 365 days of horror since October 7. Douglas, they went on to list the number of bombs Israel has dropped, the number of hospitals damaged in Gaza, the number of buildings. You get the idea. They used October 7 to highlight the impact of the counter-offensive, not what actually started the war.
Yeah, of course it did. I mean, it's completely sick, but it's a remarkable thing, this, Rita, and I've been thinking about this week because a very brilliant scholar called Ruth Wise, emeritus professor at Harvard, back from the days when institutions like Harvard really produced top-rate people, said it's quite hard to say anything new about October 7th, even a year on, because we can see it in plain sight. The terrorists broadcast everything. They didn't hide anything. Ruth Wise said something very interesting. She said, some people in the West have got the ability to understand what that day was against the Jewish state. Not everybody can. The Independent and some other idiots can't tell that. They can't even commemorate an anniversary without trying to flip it onto another aspect of the story. But what she said that really struck me was, she said, we may have the courage to do that, but the West has not displayed the ability to have the courage to identify the perpetrators. Had the courage, some people have had the courage, the recognition of who the victims were, but the perpetrators, a year on, how is it possible that there are pro-Hamas demonstrations in Australia, in America, in Canada, across Europe? How come so much of the media has, like the Independent you just showed there, to the extent that it is still a paper, how have they ended up just regurgitating Hamas figures? Why have we ended up in this period? This was, as you say, it was the biggest massacre of Jews since the Holocaust. We have the ability to identify that, but why not to identify the Nazis? Why not to identify the people who did it? Yeah. Why not ask why it is that in countries like Australia, I have seen these demonstrations of supporters of the Nazis, of the people who did the massacres? Why do we have to see mobs in New York smashing at car windows, screaming support for the Nazis who carried out October the 7th? It's because some people still have the ability, thank goodness, to recognize who the victims were, but almost nobody has the courage to identify who the perpetrators were, what's driving them, and the fact that they are among us in the West.
Oh, that is an excellent point. That is so true. And you would think all those protesters, how much more credibility they would have and how much more support if they could just condemn Hamas. Even if you want to see the war end, their refusal to condemn, and in fact, the hostility to those who turn up to a protest holding a Hamas, a terrorist sign, I think speaks volumes. Before you go, a Russian arms dealer who was known as the Merchant of Death, who was released by the US to Russia as part of a prisoner swap in exchange for WNBA player Brittney Griner, he's reportedly selling weapons to the Houthi terrorists who are wreaking havoc in the Red Sea. This looks like a terrible exchange for the US, Douglas.
It does, rather. Brittney Griner has spent all of her time since being swapped by the US government. She has spent all of her time moaning about how awful the US is. And meantime, this guy ends up continuing his career, in this case, arming terrorists. It wasn't a good deal, that. And, maybe there's, I always think that, you can't judge what somebody who's been arrested and detained in the way that Brittney Griner has. You can't judge what they do to some extent because they've been through a terrible circumstance. But you'd have thought that there could be some gratitude to the country that had nurtured them, made them rich, that they had slightly let down, and which had saved them. But oh no, of course, in our time, as you know, Rita, as we've spoken about before, you can never express gratitude to a Western democracy. It's got to be moaning and carping and all of that and whining. But never gratitude, never realizing how lucky we are in the West, how lucky we are in America and Australia and Britain and Europe. Never that, never gratitude, always whining.
Yes, it's all about victimhood. That's the currency these days. Douglas Murray, thank you so much for your time this evening.
It's a great pleasure. Thank you.